And just a little bit of background on how I got involved in this research topic. I went into the program focused on migrant workers and their access to the right to health. And last summer I spent a 3-month internship at the humanitarian organization for migration economics, otherwise known as HOME, in Singapore, where I did a research study working with migrant domestic workers who have suffered abuse from their employers or their employment agency, and trying to figure out what were the common work-related stressors they face, what were the abuses they face, and how it impacted their physical and mental well-being. And as part of that report, I also examined how current policies may have contributed to them suffering these different types of abuses. So, we look at the overview. We're going to talk. First, I'm going to introduce a bit of background on migrant domestic workers in Singapore. Then I'm going to review 2 examples of high-profile cases of abuse against migrant domestic workers. Then we're going to look at current policies that have opened up space for abuse against migrant domestic workers, and some recommendations that I have found may be useful for Singapore to improve the current policies. So, beginning with the background information, currently there is approximately 210,000 migrant domestic workers in Singapore. This is quite sizable considering, I believe, the population of Singapore is somewhere between 4.5 to 5 million people. And so foreign workers actually make up a huge percentage of Singapore's labor force. They constitute about 30%. And of that 30%, 80% are in the low skilled or unskilled category, which is what migrant domestic workers fall under. And migrant domestic workers themselves constitute 25% of the foreign workers. So if we take that into consideration, there's approximately about 800,000 foreign workers in Singapore. The entry of migrant domestic worker in Singapore society began in 1978. Basically what was happening was that Singapore's economy was rapidly developing. So Singaporean women started entering into the formal economy. When that happened, it kind of left a gap in the household where women used to be the primary caretaker of children, the home, and seniors. So how the Singaporean government at the time decided was that they were going to implement this foreign maid scheme in 1978, and it was thought to be a temporary solution. Basically, workers from the Philippines, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and India, they would come in on a 2-year work visa, work for 2 years, and then they would go back. However, what has started as a temporary solution has become permanent in Singapore because basically there aren't an increase in daycares, there aren't increases in senior care homes, and it's so affordable to actually hire a migrant domestic worker that lots of families are opting to go that option as opposed to trying to find a daycare or a senior care home for the elderly. So to give you an idea of how many families actually employ a migrant domestic worker in Singapore, it's about roughly 1 in 5 families in Singapore employ a migrant domestic worker. And like I've mentioned already, these migrant domestic workers mainly come from the Philippines and Indonesia, with smaller percentages coming from Myanmar, Sri Lanka, and India. Filipino migrant domestic workers actually make the most money, and they make approximately US $250 monthly. The reason for this is mainly because they tend to be able to speak English, which means they can communicate with their families that they're employed with. For Sri Lankans and for Indonesians, they tend to earn a lot less, and it varies between US $170 to $200 a month. So now we're going to look at 2 examples of high-profile cases of abuse against migrant domestic workers to kind of give you an idea of how extreme these abuses can get. So the first one is the abuse happened from January to May 2006, and this police officer, Lawrence Lim, he assaulted his 23-year-old Indonesian migrant domestic worker, and the assault included hitting her in the head, kicking her in the abdomen, the chest, and hips, and he was also accused of sexual abuse. So in total, he was accused of 13 counts of physical and sexual abuse. However, he was only found guilty of 6 counts of physical abuse because the sexual abuse charges were thrown out due to inconsistency in the testimony of the migrant domestic worker. Eventually, he was sentenced to jail in 2009 to a 1-year jail term in prison, which was then increased to 2 years after an unsuccessful appeal. And just to note that, these abuses happen when the migrant domestic worker would forget really simple things, such as forgetting to pack the child's clothing for an outing, or using the wrong tea on a milk bottle. And also, she was confined to the household, and she literally had to run away during the middle of the night to the embassy in order to get help. The second case of abuse that we're going to look at involves a housewife, and Brenda Tan was actually tried and convicted in 2009 for scalding her Indonesian migrant domestic worker and repatriating her without any medical attention. So what had happened was that in 2008, Tan had forced her 25-year-old migrant domestic worker to drink 2 cups of hot water, and then she poured hot water down her back. The migrant domestic worker was also forced to sleep on the balcony with dogs, which is a big religious offense because she was Muslim. Also, she wasn't paid 1.5 years of her salary, which amounted to about 4,300 Singapore dollars, which is roughly, I think, just over 3,000 US. After she had scalded the Indonesian migrant domestic worker, she quickly canceled her work permit, paid for her repatriation costs, and sent her back without any medical attention. And it wasn't until the migrant domestic worker arrived home, where her family discovered her injuries, that they brought her to the hospital, then notified the department that was involved with the care of migrant domestic workers, who then notified Singapore, and then she was arrested, tried, and convicted in a Singaporean court of law. So these cases kind of show how there is this big unevenness in power in the household between the employer and the migrant domestic worker. However, what also brings forth the question is really, how has the state contributed to such abuses against migrant domestic workers in Singapore? So for example, why was Tan able to repatriate her Indonesian migrant domestic worker at such ease and almost be able to hide her crime? So we're going to look now at the current policies that are basically opening up space for such abuses to occur in the household. So the first one we're going to talk about is the lack of labor rights. Migrant domestic workers are not covered under the Employment Act, and this is actually a really big issue, because if they were covered under the Employment Act, they would be guaranteed a minimum of 1 rest day per week, a maximum of 44 hours work hours per week, limits on salary deductions, and 14 days of paid sick leave. However, Singapore's government have argued that due to the private nature of their work, that the Employment Act would be really hard to enforce if migrant domestic workers fell under the Employment Act. So instead, they're covered under the Foreign Manpower Act, which provides some labor protections, but they're far less comprehensive. So the first main issue then is that there is no minimum wage set. And this is a big problem because the state has argued that it should be left to the market rate, and that the wage should be negotiated between the employer, the employment agent, and the migrant domestic worker. What it fails to acknowledge is that there's migrant domestic workers, as soon as they step foot on Singapore, they're already at a huge disadvantage in terms of negotiating, because they've already incurred months of debts. So I'll explain a little bit of that later, but basically, due to the financial pressures, they're more willing to accept a lower wage in order to get a job and to pay off their debt. The second issue is that there's no mandatory rest day. There is a recommended 8 hours of continuous rest a day in the standard employment contract, but it's not actually a requirement. So it's not unusual for migrant domestic workers to work 365 days a year and have an average of 6 hours of sleep a night. So the second issue is the security bond, monthly levy, and loan repayments. Basically, the security bond is a $5,000 bond that the employer will have to pay if the migrant domestic worker is found to be either pregnant or that they've run away. And the monthly levy is just a monthly fee that they have to pay for the government for employing a migrant domestic worker. So this is on top of what they're paying the migrant domestic worker. The problem with these two fees is that it kind of puts more pressure on the employer to confine the migrant domestic workers to the household, especially if they don't trust them. So this kind of causes like an issue of restriction on freedom of movement and also communication with family members and friends. And also, there's a lack of regulation and the limit of how much the employment agencies are allowed to charge migrant domestic workers. So basically what happens is that migrant domestic workers come over and all their fees are fronted by the employment agency. So in order to pay them back, they're usually charged 6 to 9 months of their salary. So for the first 6 to 9 months, they make absolutely no money, and all their salary goes straight to the employment agency. And this is actually quite a huge debt because Singapore's government could put a limit on it, but they refuse to. So migrant domestic workers tend to get exploited. And I think the last issue that we're going to cover is also there's too much power to the employer. Basically, in Article 9 of the Foreign Manpower Act, it gives the employer the right to effectively cancel a worker's permit and repatriate immediately without notification to the state, as long as they just filed the correct papers. So as we've seen with Tan's case, there is a big problem with that because it's easier for the employer to hide their crimes. And also, the employers are responsible for the well-being and care of the migrant domestic worker because they have to live within the household. But then again, it doesn't take into account how the employer is actually the biggest threat to the migrant domestic workers in a lot of cases. And we're just going to quickly go over the direct violations of Articles 11, 12, and 16 of CEDAW. Basically, Singapore has only signed 2 international human rights instruments, which is the Convention of Rights of the Child and the Convention on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. So, however, their current policies on migrant domestic workers unable to marry freely, and also the denial of their reproductive rights, such as once they're discovered to be pregnant, their work permits immediately canceled, they're immediately sent back. And if they try to marry a Singaporean citizen without the approval of the state, then they are banned permanently from coming into Singapore again. So these are just some recommendations that I found that I had included in my report to the organization I was working with for Singapore's government to kind of improve the labor standards for migrant domestic workers. And the first is establish a minimum wage. Second is establish a mandatory weekly rest day for migrant domestic workers and a maximum limit on weekly work hours. Reform the employer's right to repatriate at will. Dissolve the security bond and monthly levy. Reform her policies regarding right to marry and reproductive health rights. Sign and ratify the International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and the members of their families, and establish a Human Rights Commission. And being involved in the drafting of the current IL's Convention on Decent Work for Domestic Workers. So, yeah, thank you.